Hello and welcome to this narrated PowerPoint about trying to understand how the teenage brain works. My name is Mr. Wadsworth and I am pleased to announce that I am the Assistant Principal here at Hurstmere. Now look at the questions that are being asked about your teenage years. A lot of people may have answered with the following three words: successful, restricted, safe, but not everyone. However, surely this is what we want for our children. Other impacts can be hormones, the need to develop independence from family, pressures from school, exams, relationships, cultural context, social media, uncertainty about the future. All of the above are true, but there are many different factors contributing to the adolescent's behaviour. We now know that there are also highly significant changes happening in the brain at this time during adolescence, which have complex effects on behaviour and thinking. So the question asks, what behaviours do we typically associate with teenagers? So what behaviours are we talking about? Certainly the lack of conversation, surliness, hormonal. But is this new? This quote, our youth now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for their elders and love chatter in places of exercise. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobble up their food, and terrorise their teachers. Now, where did this quote come from? Well, believe it or not, this quote is from Socrates, a Greek philosopher, and the teenagers that he's talking about were 2,500 years ago. So previous research into the brain structure has looked specifically at babies or at the other end of the spectrum, particularly older adults with Alzheimer's disease. However, new research is looking at the brains of teenagers and discovering that there is a remarkable amount of changes taking place in the brain at this crucial time of stages of development. The question is, can these changes in the brain help to explain some of the behaviours we see in teenagers, which we have seen for centuries? I'm going to start by describing some of the changes that researchers have shown take place during adolescence. Then we will think about some of the effects these changes can have on different areas of teenagers' life. Then we will finish by thinking about things that we can do differently, as staff in schools or indeed parents, aunties, uncles, friends, etc., to support young people as they go through this period of change. I should say I will be using the terms adolescents / teenagers interchangeably throughout, but we're talking about young people of secondary age. So previously it was assumed brain development occurred through the first few years of life. Now, with the advancement of technology to study the brain, we know this isn't true. Restructuring takes place in the brain throughout our lives in response to the environment the brain experiences. For example, the brain of a violinist, there are extra connections in the brain that controls the fingers on the left hand. So what we do can alter the brain. However, research has shown that adolescence is a time of considerable change in the brain, and that there is an increased opportunity to learn and develop new skills in this stage of life, which then diminishes as we get older and move into adulthood. The first big change happens in early adolescence, and it's called proliferation. There is a rapid growth of brain matter and the formation of lots of new connections between the brain cells. In mid-adolescence, those connections which are not being stimulated simply get pruned back or lost. This is the idea of use it or lose it. A young person may lose skills that they were once very good at, and if they're not continuing to practice or do a sport / activity, they can be reinstated or new ones formed, but not it's so easy to make the new connections or learn new skills later in life. Finally, in late adolescence, those most used connections get insulated and make the signal travel along the pathways as efficient as possible. This is called myelination. and this increases the efficiency, therefore giving you full intellectual power. These are what brain cells, or neurons as they are called, look like. You can see the branches, the dendrites, which connect the axon of another cell with a tiny space in between called a synapse. When we talk about messages being sent in the brain, what we mean is that the tiny electrical current is sent down the axon, across the synapse and into the dendrites of the connecting cell. Each time we repeat any action or thought or memory, the same set of neurons fire their currents and the connections are made stronger. So in early adolescence, many more connections form between the cells in the brain. Some other relevant aspects of the adolescent brain are shown here. Firstly, we know that different parts of the brain develop at different rates. We know that during adolescence, big changes are taking place in the prefrontal cortex through the proliferation and the pruning process, as I've just described. The prefrontal cortex is not working efficiently in young teenagers. When an adult experiences damage to the prefrontal cortex, some of the symptoms can be experienced. Loss of social skills, arguments, overreacting, making inappropriate comments, difficulty grasping the moral of the story, unable to plan ahead or work out the consequence of an action. Sounds a bit like a teenager to me. There are also gender differences. One of the most notable is that the brain changes and therefore adolescence begin at a younger age for girls. We also know that in general, male brains are better at processing details and systems, where female brains seem to be wired more for social skills, verbal skills and bonding. We know that boys are more prone to difficulty in verbal skills. Girls' language develops earlier. Female brains are more symmetrical. Men's right half is often slightly larger, and we seem to process things slightly differently too. There are also the difference in the sex hormones between boys and girls, estrogen and testosterone primarily, and we know adolescence is a period where hormones are less settled than in other life stages. Finally, we know that the adolescent brains are more sensitive to certain brain chemicals. Dopamine, which is a chemical that makes us want to seek pleasure, the kind of pleasure that we get when we take risks. Research shows that there are differences in adolescents respond compared to adults, and one of the impacts of alcohol is to increase the dopamine levels, making us more likely to seek pleasure and take risks. A toxin is also a chemical in the brain which has a pleasurable feel-good factor and is related to social rewards. There are unnecessary connections which impact on processing, in particular the immaturity of the prefrontal cortex, which can mean that decisions are taken using the more mature emotional gut reaction systems. The limbic system, rather than our rational logical prefrontal cortex, can be used. Adolescents can think as well as adults, but it takes longer to process information and make the right response. One example of this shown is that teenagers typically struggle to interpret facial expressions. In a test, researchers showed that adults were much better at reading facial expressions than teenagers, but also that teenagers use a different part of the brain from adults when they did the test. Adolescents were more likely to have misinterpreted the adult fear or concern as disgust or a negative attitude. So therefore, they seemed to be disappointed or disapproving. So they reacted with what they thought the adult would have intended. So they walked away or come out with a smart comment or got huffy, etc. They often realise afterwards that they misinterpreted the expression. The process is just slower. Studies also consistently show that teenagers need more sleep than children in pre-adolescence and adults. However, melatonin, the chemical in our brains to release us and help us sleep, is later than that for children and adults. so teenagers often don't feel tired until later at night. Assuming they then get up and come to school, they have not had enough sleep, which as we probably all know from experience, on impacts on mood, memory, concentration, reaction speed. Lack of sleep is also linked to mental health problems. Some studies suggest that the prefrontal cortex in adults is working harder, though less effective, particularly when the situation is socially embarrassing. Stress impairs our ability to rationalise information anyway, and in most teens are in the throes of adolescence during one of the most stressful periods of their life. Changing schools, new friends, and there is physical changes which can make them feel incompetent or out of control, voice wobbling. We will come back and discuss more about stress in a bit. That said, it is important to note that amongst these things, the benefit the brain changes of having the proliferation of connections is that the teenager's brain is the optimal state of new learning. The pruning and myelination then make the brain more efficient and allow it to excel and specifically well practiced at certain skills. After these processes are complete, it is harder, though not impossible, for us to learn new things. So there is a real positive element too. Another effect of the brain changes can be seen in risk-taking behaviour. Risk-taking can be a positive thing. We need to take risks to survive and be successful. We need it to seek out new experiences. Most of us feel we need to experience some excitement and pleasure in life, although there are significant differences between people in this. It is suggested that teenagers take more risks because risk-taking in adolescence has historically given them an adaptive edge. Succeeding often requires moving out of the home and into less secure situations. We notice their dangerous behaviours, but there are also positive sensation-seeking behaviours, e.g. seeking out new people, new learning, new environments, getting out of the house and exploring, taking a gap year or leaving home to go to university, all involve risk, but we encourage our adolescent children to do these things. However, teenagers are more likely to engage in risky and dangerous behaviours as they need the greater risk than adults to experience the same dopamine levels and therefore have that pleasure. It is not that they don't understand the risk, they do, but they value the reward more heavily than adults, especially in a social context, and in their gut and emotional reactions which are stronger than logic or reason, as we've discussed previously. Also, the use of alcohol increases the likelihood of risk-taking behaviour. Risk-taking can be socially meditated by being egged on, but on the other hand, having contact with risk-takers can mean that you don't have to. It depends on your place in the pack. The stronger your sense of identity or the self-ego strength, the more likely you are able to withstand social pressures to take risks. However, we may make bad judgments and often find ourselves in risky situations. Being rejected by the pack is a very scary place for adolescents to find themselves. At the time when normal family-based support systems are weakened with the peer group influence, it's irresistible to many. If we think about getting into a car with a drunk friend, adults are more likely to be able to rationally make a judgment that is not sensible. Adolescents are much less able to do this. The teenage brain is particularly vulnerable to alcohol. Studies suggest that it takes only half the amount of alcohol to damage the teenage brain than it does in adults, and the damage is less likely to be repaired. Also, addiction is more likely if you begin using alcohol as a teenager. Drinking regularly before the age of 15 makes you 5 times more likely to be a heavy drinker than it does in adulthood. Also, alcohol and drugs, whilst we know has a depressant effect on the brain, also makes you become gregarious and fun and take more risks. 75% of 16 to 20-year-olds who have sex use contraceptives when sober, only 13% when drunk. As the slide says, these are not pathways you want to reinforce in the brain. Adolescence can be considered to be a perfect storm of factors which can lead to a significant stress for young people. Depression and low mood are high in prevalence at this stage of life. As adults, we can sometimes look back and think, what were we worried about? We didn't have bills or children or jobs to think about. However, the changes in the brain and body combined with a vast array of social and educational pressures can be difficult for young people to manage. As I've said, young people can experience strong emotions that they don't know how to control, changes in their body which seem scary or embarrassing. The pressure to conform, belong and fit in is very, very strong. It is argued that the purpose of adolescence, in evolutionary terms, is to become independent from parents, to separate and lead an adult life for ourselves. So the conflict with parents and the desire to please friends is natural byproduct of this process. But that is so stressful for everyone. Research suggests that whilst stress responses are similar whatever age we are, there is evidence that teenagers are slower to adapt to new stress they experience. Teenagers can experience significant stress at school through pressure to succeed, exams, friendship, social media, and in particular teenagers who are naturally introverted can experience small stresses throughout the school day, especially at break and lunch times, which are when they are meant to relax and unwind. The internet alone creates significant increases of stress for all ages, but arguably teenagers are more susceptible to this. There is an information overload and repetition of bad news and continual distraction from text, email, WhatsApp, Facebook, messages, Snapchat, Instagram and all the other ones that I haven't heard of and dread for when my children are older that I'm going to be using. Social networking creates connections with more people than are manageable, fosters competition and unrealistic goals of perfection. A self-inflicted lack of privacy and risks of cyberbullying are pronoun. Teachers are prone to be self-conscious anyway, and social media can exacerbate that. On top of this, as we've discussed, they probably aren't getting enough sleep, and we all know how much worse we can feel and stresses become bigger when we are tired. So what can we do? We often think that we know what's happening, but when we see our children, not as we normally would see them, sometimes a more gentle, less confrontational approach to discussing emotions is needed. You look as if. The statement says, I'm going to say something and I want you to tell me if I have got it right. And if not, can you tell me what I should have said? Well-judged humour is great and feedback can help, but as a statement of fact, not as a personal criticism. We can help by modelling self-talk. Let's think about that. Or, I didn't really understand. Hear what you were saying. Could you just tell me again about? Engaging in a containing and thoughtful dialogue demonstrates a different way of managing miscommunications. The task of adolescence is to establish your own identity. Evidence is that adolescents like to talk to parents and value this when it's done in a respectful and thoughtful dialogue. Modelling and expectations help to shape how adolescents will act. Adults need to help adolescents recognise their own strengths and abilities. This is by giving positive feedback and encouragement to keep going, along with reassurance that it will happen or improve. You're good at this. You seem really to enjoy that. Help them to interpret misfortune. That was unlucky. He didn't mean to hurt you. It was accidental. Encourage achievable, realistic goal setting and highlight the effort is key. A growth mindset sees problems as useful and doesn't expect things to be right. Skills take time to develop. Practice is everything, up to mastery. The most successful sports people are generally the ones that practice hardest after everyone else had gone home and were more committed. A fixed mindset believes that if you have to work at something, it doesn't really count. Self-discipline, self-regulation, and determination to improve are far more important in the outcome than the raw talent. The brain can perform new complex functions, but at first it does this clumsily. So in adolescence, it's a great time to learn these new skills and info. Use it or lose it. Find out where your interests, passions lie. Broad general education plus extracurricular school activities is a good way of encouraging this. Encourage independence, being your own person, being an individual, not always following the pack, making choices for their own, and coping with the consequences. But this can be difficult because of the pressures to conform to peers, as we've touched on. So what can you as parents do to help support this adolescent period? Well, what you can do is support the development of the prefrontal cortex by talking about choices and slowing them down to allow rational processing from the frontal cortex to kick in helps. Helping them to think. So what would you do, say, what would you do if you fell out with your girlfriend at a party? Would you walk home? Then what? Talk through problem solving options. So what would you say if one of your pals decided to go into a shop and take something? If someone is being picked on? If. As a dialogue, not as if there's only one way of must, thought, or how it should be, which closes down the conversation and makes them feel that you're being judgmental. Modelling problem solving prepares the brain to be able to take on skills. Seeing or hearing about how others deal with challenges is a powerful experience. Discuss facts. Adults tend to provide scare stories which adolescents don't believe. Socially, we are often hypocritical in our attitudes about smoking, drinking and drugs. Legal highs. Adolescents will likely experiment with substances at some point in time, so they need to know about the facts and the risks of how to cope, not absolute bans which are unrealistic. Adolescents also do value being able to talk to adults, but are more likely to talk to parents of their friends for support or information. We need to definitely encourage healthy sleep patterns. Ideally, this involves not using a screen for an hour before bed, planning relaxation activities before bed, not drinking anything with caffeine or too much sugar, and then also writing down any worries that anybody might have. And lastly, relaxation. Relaxation is vital for us all, not just teens, but it is vital for them in a stressful period of their life. Encourage young people to have time doing things that they enjoy. Teach them relaxation techniques, encourage regular exercise and healthy eating, which helps with the mood. Okay, that concludes my talk on the teenage brain, and hopefully it's given you some insight into how the teenagers will think and act, and probably, hopefully, giving you a few tips along the way. There is some more further information that can be found on this slide in front of me, and if you go onto the YouTube link on there, if you can access that, there is a small video, a small talk by Adele Faber. Thank you again, and thank you for listening.